Well, welcome back, everyone, to Open Line. We are talking about police reform here in Nashville. We have with us two people from NOAA, that is the Nashville Organized for Action and Hope. They are joining us via Zoom, and there they are, Jane Boram, Teresa Smallwood, and we had a good conversation there at the top of the show, so let's go to some calls now. Let's go to Jim. Hello, Jim.
Good evening, sir.
Go right ahead.
All right, ladies, number one, let me say this. I applaud you for seeing needs and going with them, but let's be clear about what the police have to deal with. You were talking about the protest back in the summertime. No, there were some protests, but there was mostly mobs. We had a federal building burned. We had businesses on Broadway burned. Now, though, that's wrong. And the problem is those that are truly part of a movement and trying to make change find themselves inserted with people that want nothing but anarchy. We have to find a way to separate that. And when that happens, those that are truly wanting to make change and have their protests mean something needs to walk away from that. But until now, that has not happened. It hasn't happened in Portland. It hasn't happened in Louisville. It hasn't happened in Minneapolis. And it didn't happen here in Nashville. That has to stop. And there is no excuse for it. The people are upset. Fine. I understand that. I will never know what you have experienced as a black woman. I won't even pretend to. But what I will say is that there is a mutual respect for people that we have lost, and that extends to the police. There are bad cops, but there are mostly good cops, and we need to realize that and try to work with that paradigm that we're looking at. But again, let me say, ladies, thank you for what you're doing, but there is a lot of issues on both sides that we do need to deal with. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, Jim, thank you for the call. I won't restate what he said, but there's a lot there, and I'll let each of you talk about it. Teresa, why don't we start with you? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think Jim makes an impassioned plea for giving the police a little bit of leeway. And it's not an unnatural argument to make when we think of police as public safety officers. We're not dealing with that. What we're talking about is police brutality and excessive force. And what I can say to Jim is this. When a building is burned, there are already laws on the books. They're called arson. When a building is broken into, there are already laws on the books. That is breaking and entering. When something else happens that is of a criminal nature, I can promise you, there are already laws on the books that deal with that. And even if it's anarchy, there are laws in place already. So when our state legislature assembles itself for purposes of clandestinely taking away people's free speech rights, that is not a response to what you have described. That is an opportunity to be prescriptive in people's rights and to suggest that this city can't take care of itself. And it is really a move towards a greater anarchy, which allows for political authoritarianism to take over.
And I want you to also comment, Jane. The other thing that I heard him saying was that when these protests become violent, that some of the causes that you are espousing get wrapped up in that, and it damages them. What do you say to that, of what he was saying?
Well, having been in protest as a younger person, having marched in D.C. and New York City, having been almost trampled by equestrian police in D.C., sometimes just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, you can become a victim of police brutality. So it doesn't mean that I was doing anything wrong in D.C. I was sitting on a lawn and had stampeding horses come after me and my friends. Sometimes it's not what it looks like on TV. TV catches sometimes the worst of the worst. And some of those persons who were breaking laws, like Teresa said, do deserve to have charges pressed against them for breaking laws. I never broke any laws. I never destroyed property. The thing I was charged with at one point was trespassing, which is oftentimes a trumped-up charge to just get you out of the way. So arson, property damage, breaking and entering, those are not part of protesting. Those are someone's out of control, acting out behavior for who knows what purposes. But they weren't really part of what the basic protest was about. And so often people will say, well, you know, it was just a couple of bad cops who did this, a couple of bad cops did that. We're not talking about just a couple bad apples. And this sometimes sways people in their public opinion, and it's like an individually directed anger at a particular cop who did something wrong. Here's a statistic for you. In 2018, the Phoenix Police Department shot more people, 44 people. They shot more people than any other police department in the country. That was including Los Angeles, who shot 33, New York 23, Philadelphia 12. In other words, these weren't just individual cops who did something bad. This was a whole system. This was a whole police department who felt like they had the right to just do whatever they thought was necessary at the time without thinking through, without actually de-escalating the situation. And even Interim Chief Drake says, we need to de-escalate, de-escalate, de-escalate. He understands that more now, and he understands that our police force needs to get trained in those kinds of thought patterns.
So you think this is an important conversation to be having? I hear what that last caller said, Jim, and I know Jim is not alone, and so I want to talk about it. You know, he throws out things like Portland. And he threw out the damage to property that was done in one protest here in Nashville. The vast majority of other marches were peaceful. There was the one where there was some property damage. And when people lump all protests in with Portland, or lump all protests in with violence or property damage, are you concerned that there is that language that is now, those talking points are now out there? Are you concerned by that, or do you think that's not happening and that's not a concern? And I'll let Teresa, you can talk to that.
Concern, yes. I'm concerned because there is a tendency in this country to conflate arguments and to flip arguments on top of the people who have genuine concerns. And so, but I didn't hear that in that caller. What I heard in him was a real reasoned opportunity to say, listen, I believe we need to have more mutual respect. But what he falls down on is the ability for a legislature to come and make that particular action something that they take on as a specific way to respond and to quell people's protests. That's a very different thing than to deal with the outbreak of actual criminality. What I think is that when you converge things in that way, it confuses a lot of people, but I'm not confused. I understand very clearly what's happening. We have a legislature operating in the same systemic racism that we said in that letter. And all the systems from top to bottom have the capacity for that. When the legislature can say to a city, we're going to prohibit you from having inclusive lines drawn in your city for purposes of having inclusion in various neighborhoods, you know there is only one motivation. It's racism. And so when someone says to me that because there are a few bad cops, see, I don't buy the few bad cops thing. I think Jane is absolutely correct. We're talking about bad cultures within policing. And those bad cultures lead to 3 and 4 cops going into someone's home and all of them shooting. There's something wrong with that. That is anarchy. That is blue lives matter more than any other life.
And how confident are you that this can be a moment in time where we turn that around?
Are you speaking to me, Steve?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Here again, I will repeat what I've said. I think we are in a very good moment here in Nashville because the will of the people is something that we have the political will to move forward in the things that we desire. We showed that through the Community Oversight Board and how it came to be. Now, the reflex is that Americans for Prosperity has now brought forth a rebase. But what I know is that there are more people in Nashville who feel what we feel than you have even given credit for. And we have the capacity as NOAA to help mobilize them.
Okay. And now you're talking about Americans for Prosperity. That's the property tax repeal. That's what you're talking about there. And Jane, what do you want to add to all of that? I mean, I thought the last caller, that was interesting. He did talk about a mutual respect for people has been lost, but he also did lump in Portland with all of the protests, and that's become a talking point. What do you think?
Well, let's face it. News is sensationalistically based. I mean, that's what people like to watch the news for. They get a little bit of a thrill, a little bit of a vicarious thrill out of that. So, and that's not to knock the news media. That's just how things are. My cat's playing with my pen here. So anyway, when you try to get into deeper issues, though, that's what NOAA is trying to get at. This isn't a show. This isn't a sensationalistic presentation of just some shots or some videos that get someone excited. This is trying to think through how people's daily lives are affected by systems that are unjust and set up to favor one race of people over another race of people. And this began, of course, in the Civil War era. This began after the Civil War and Deconstruction. This happened with unions. This happened with immigrants that were coming into the country in the early 1900s, my grandfather of whom was one. The police at that point was set up to protect white people's property and the established white base of capitalism as it was in those days. So Irish people, German people, Jewish people, Chinese people, those were the targets of brutality then. So, we have shifted, but we still have an unfair system that's run by mainly white male capitalists. And I'm not saying that capitalism all by itself is bad. I'm saying that the people who are in power are not going to share that power very easily without putting up a fight. And that if you're going to have a fair distribution of wealth in this country, then it has to be distributed among all races and all ethnic and economic groups, not just by those who have an unfair advantage over another person. There is no level playing field right now.
And it's interesting, your organization is doing it through churches. And Teresa, I heard you talking a little before the show about your background. Could you briefly tell us your background? You're both pastors, right? Is that right?
Right.
I'm actually not a full-time pastor. I work as the social justice minister at New Covenant Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. But I have a day job as well, and I am an academic. I work at the Vanderbilt Divinity School.
Great. And you have a law degree.
I have a law degree. I practiced law many years before going back to school to get my humanities degrees.
So it's fascinating sort of perspective on all of this. All right, we're going to take a break. We'll come back. Ann, Jeffrey, others, hold on the line. Take a break. Be back right after this.